And so with that, yes, we can now begin with our first panel. I guess we kind of have like dual moderators for this one, because I'm going to sort of like help out a little bit with the moderation, because our two panelists, our first panelist, Dr. Metka Potočnik, was doing some moderating, but she's got some presentations to do, as well. And our first speaker panelist, Professor Madhavi Sunder, has an extraordinary presentation on a very important IP social justice topic that couldn't be more at the forefront of the global IP ecosystem. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with Professor Sunder's presentation, and after we have gone through this, because I don't want to give it away, spoiler alert or anything, what the topic is, and immediately as Professor Sunder goes into it, we will all say, okay, we see why this is of international concern. This is right at the heart of the global ecosystem, and why a social justice perspective is critical to solving this IP-centered challenge. And then after that, we will move to Dr. Metka Potočnik's presentation. So each of our speakers, as you know, we have their titles, their bios, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to eat up their time talking about them and introducing them. Instead, I'm going to actually turn it right over to them. And let's get started with Professor Madhavi Sunder.
Well, thank you so much, Lateef. It is really an honor to be here. It's always inspiring to see how this group has grown in numbers, in the breadth of the issues being covered under IP social justice. Let me just start actually first by thanking Dean Kearney and Marquette Law School for hosting. And of course, so many faculty who are on the screen have been working in this space for decades. So not all of you are that old, but some have been really at it for a long time. But of course, need to shout out for Professor Kali Murray, Professor Lateef Mtima, Deirdre Keller, who I don't know if she's here on the screen, but obviously leader in this space from the beginning in this particular forum, Professor Anjali Bhatts. I mean, so many who have really brought these issues, these perspectives, this lens to the center. My early days, we were on the periphery. You've brought it to the center, and the DOJ is reaching out to say, how can we bring a race and social justice perspective to our practice? I think we're going mainstream, which is amazing. Let it not dissipate any of the power of our analyses, though, along the way. So let me share my screen, and let's see. So I have a few slides, not too many, but basically, as Professor Mtima was saying, a number of scholars in the IP space have been for a long time, of course, thinking about patents and public health, the critical issue of access to medicines, from HIV medicines to cancer drugs, high cholesterol medications. So essential medicines around the spectrum, really across the spectrum. For, again, this is work that's been going on for decades. But then, of course, the issue came to the global stage and front and center of the global stage during the pandemic, as we saw massive inequity with respect to global access to vaccines. So last November, my colleague, Professor Hao-Chin Sun at Hong Kong University, and I at Georgetown convened a conference. It was on Zoom, truly global conference. In fact, for IP social justice, it's hard to go back, right? When we have this access and the ability of people to participate from around the world that we saw emerge during the pandemic. It's hard to go back to in-person because of inequities and climate impacts too of those those kinds of gatherings. But we were able to host a conference online looking at intellectual property and access to vaccines diagnoses for what was going wrong, what was contributing to these failures, this tragic inequity in terms of access to essential medicine, and then also thinking about cures. So we were able to gather scholars, but also practitioners, global institutional leaders from the World Intellectual Property Organization in November 2021. And I have to say, we have a book coming out on this. The manuscript's going to get turned in December 1st. And we have just an amazing array of contributors in terms of scholars and intellectual thought leaders, public health leaders who are contributing to this volume. One other I think Lateef mentioned the practical impact of the work in this area and our commitment to that. One that I'm very proud of is during the chat in that conference when Edward Kwakwa, the deputy director of the World Intellectual Property Organization last November, was giving his keynote. During the chat, some of us were suggesting he was talking about there's actually a global academy at the WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, where they have access to tens and to thousands of students, especially in developing countries, who are lawyers and policymakers and leaders in the intellectual property space. And so we actually suggested a partnership between Harvard's Patent X course on patents and the World Intellectual Property Organization. Now Georgetown Law, Hong Kong University, and Harvard are officially launching a partnership with WIPO. We have 100% of control, academic control over the course, and the course has been modified significantly to really emphasize the needs of developing countries. It's got a number of, I think, fantastic case studies from developing countries in terms of how to leverage patent law. So one, learning patent law, but leveraging patent law to address global public health crises. So very excited that that's being launched. So let me share with you, basically we have about 15 chapter contributions. They're not all in, they're kind of, coming in slowly. What I'm sharing with you is the introduction to the volume that Professor Sun and I have drafted. And the goal of the volume is really to kind of first tell the story of what happened and what was the role of intellectual property in this inequitable distribution, and also to begin to diagnose kind of more specifically what were some of the causes of that inequitable distribution. And then second, it is to start thinking and really organizing the chapters and the contributions of our amazing authors to think in a more organized fashion about what the cures should be for the next pandemic, how to be better prepared for the next pandemic. So, oh, you know what? I didn't press play. There we go. So we're going to play. Yeah. So, we have long recognized that intellectual property is a question of life or death. And the vaccines have been, especially in that first year, the critical first year of their rollout in 2021, the vaccines have been attributed as leading to saving some 20 million lives. So 20 million lives were saved from the rollout of vaccines in 2021. The vast majority of that benefit, however, not surprisingly, went to high and upper middle income countries. And in fact, a September 2022 Lancet study did a mathematical model and found that in fact, 45% of the deaths in low-income countries could have been averted in 2021 if just 20% of the most high-risk patients in low and middle-income countries had been vaccinated at the end of 2021. And in fact, that was the goal. That was the goal of the COVID-19 vaccines global access facility known as COVAX. COVAX, early on in the pandemic, had set the goal to collect through procurement from rich countries enough funds to be able to purchase enough vaccine doses to distribute to 20, so that all countries, no matter whether low, middle, or high income, would be able to meet the needs of 20% of their population. And this is critically focusing on the medical service providers and elderly populations in all countries around the world. So this had been the goal. That was not met. We didn't even meet half of that goal in 2021. And so the Lancet study concludes that, in fact, 45% of the deaths in low-income countries could have been averted had we met that. Now, what's interesting, of course, the Lancet study recognizes, and as most studies in this area recognize, there are a number of factors that contributed to the inequitable distribution of vaccines in 2021. So those factors include misinformation, vaccine hesitancy, insufficient vaccine donations, vaccine nationalism, which I'll be talking about, and poor distribution and delivery infrastructure in low and middle income countries and around the world. But make no mistake, intellectual property played a central role and looms as a central figure in this story. And so the goal, and the Lancet study itself puts the spotlight on IP, acknowledging, quote, the considerable uncertainty inherent in estimating vaccine impact. However, the study concludes that more lives could have been saved if vaccines, which had been distributed more rapidly to many parts of the world, which going forward would require, quote, intellectual property to be shared more quickly in the future with more open technology and knowledge transfer surrounding vaccine production and allocation. So the study really puts the spotlight, and that's the goal of our book, really. And this introduction isn't to say that IP is the only cause or the only culprit here, but it is, as I think Professor Mtima began, what is our responsibility to think about whether intellectual property is in fact being used as a tool to promote access and well-being around the world. So that's what we're doing in this piece, and we're setting it up, and we're really kind of talking about 2021 as this law.
Madhavi, can I just interrupt, because we're wondering, have you moved any of the slides yet? Because we're not seeing them moving, so we're just checking to make sure, because it might be just in your. Are you using two screens? Because maybe you are moving them on the other screen and it's not showing with us. So we just wanted to. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I am moving the screens. So do you know what I need to do to fix it?
Do you have a button that says swap displays? Could be somewhere on top left.
A button that in here in Zoom, you mean?
Yeah, well, I guess in Zoom. Should say swap display so that you actually
okay, let me go to share screen again. Okay, is that so?
If you do it just like that, we do see it moving, but if you want to put it on slideshow.
Is that when it's not, so now it's not moving?
Yeah, are you using two screens, two displays?
I don't know what you mean by two screens.
So you know, I have two screens, so I have a laptop and an additional screen. So if you
I'm not using two screens. I'm just on the laptop. Should I just put it into
I think
this view? Are you able to see this?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Sure. Yeah. So we're really describing 2021 as this lost year, and of course, as UN General Secretary Boutros Antonio Guterres has said, we often see the role of intellectual property as part of this great success story with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine development. And in fact, IP and patents are seen as this is the poster child for the success of patents and innovation. And yet at the same time, there was this tragic inequity with respect to the distribution. And so as the General Secretary has said, we passed the science test, but we received an F in ethics. And so what did the numbers look like in 2021? And we're looking at, so the vaccines were really kind of developed by the end of 2020. And so the Lancet study is looking, at the period of exactly 1 year after that to December 2021. And so of 7 billion vaccines that were administered globally by late 2021, only 70% of these jabs had gone to high income countries. Less than 4% of people in low income countries had received a dose of the vaccine by the end of 2021. And of course, in low income African countries, such as Nigeria, Mali, and Uganda, a mere 1% of the population had been vaccinated a year after the vaccines were rolled out. Even in early January 2022, it was a mere 8.5% of people in low-income countries that had been vaccinated. And so the story that we often hear is about IP's role in leading to the development at breakneck speed of the Moderna, Pfizer, and other vaccines. But in fact, we're laying out 5 different elements in terms of diagnosing what went wrong. And the first is that this story of the development of the vaccines is itself incomplete. But even before I get to that, and I'm going to just briefly highlight these issues, but even before I get to that, there is the broader background question: what is the role of intellectual property? Is it just to develop more technologies, or should we also be thinking of the distribution of these technologies? So we readily accept IP's role in promoting efficiency, but does IP also have an obligation to promote equity? So, so part of the reason why the story kind of begins and ends with development is I think we still need to center these other values apart from efficiency and incentives for production around the distributive justice and access as well. Those values need to continually be recentered. But in fact, the development story is an incomplete one. And these breakneck, highly effective vaccines were not, in fact, the result of private companies going it alone, and were in fact highly dependent on significant public partnership and massive public investment. So here, the Trump administration here in the United States, of course, in early 2020, launched Operation Warp Speed. And so we invested billions of taxpayer funding into a number of companies, those that were successful, 1.5 billion to Johnson & Johnson, 1.2 billion to Oxford University AstraZeneca, 2.48 billion to Moderna. The German government also invested $500 million in Pfizer. The Indian government helped to develop its own homegrown vaccines. And of course, we know this to be the case in China as well. And part of the story here is, yes, the massive public investment with respect to research and development, with respect to funding clinical trials, and of course, the upfront government procurement contracts, the guaranteed contracts to purchase hundreds of millions of doses. All of this helped to hasten the speed of the development of these vaccines. But it's important to recognize that public investment in the vaccine space is not new. And in fact, this is a technology that often needs critical public-private partnership to succeed. As Lawrence Gostin, the public health expert, has written and argued, the intellectual property system does not generally incentivize companies to produce vaccines or medicines that are intended for small or uncertain markets. So we're not, really the public investment here is not something that's an anomaly, but it certainly needs to be, we need to be reminded of this, and in terms of the enormous amounts. But the problem, the reason that this that is part of the failure story is that though there was massive investment of public dollars and publicly funded research from the National Institutes of Health, for example, there were no strings attached here. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Moderna and other companies were claiming full intellectual property control and private property rights over technology that was in fact the result of much public investment. So that's part of the story that we're trying to complicate the story around the development of the vaccines, calling BS on the idea that this was actually the poster child of patents as incentives for breakthrough innovation and the need for private, incentives for private companies. We really need to, one, recognize the ongoing need for massive public investment here, and then ask these questions at the end of the day, though, who should call the shots, and bolstering mechanisms for government levers and legal levers, but also political will, really, to be able to engage those levers as needed. So that's the development story. Then there's the distribution story. And so, as I mentioned, on the distribution side, global philanthropic leaders and leaders in public health had gotten together early on, and the brainchild was this COVID-19 vaccines global access facility called COVAX. And the idea was that rich countries, of COVAX was to pool donations from rich countries ahead of time so that COVAX would have a fund through which they could purchase intellectual property protected vaccine doses, enough to raise 2 billion, get access to 2 billion doses, so that 20% of the world's countries, the most at-risk populations around the world, would receive a dose in 2021. In the end, COVAX didn't deliver on even half of this goal, and low-income countries, as we saw, fell tragically behind. We have a wonderful contribution in the volume from public health law scholars Matt Kavanaugh and Renu Singh, and they, I think, very persuasively argue that the critical problem here was the reliance by COVAX on an intellectual property plus philanthropy model. The COVAX model keeps intellectual property protections in these vaccines and these technologies fully in place, and yet it relies on this philanthropical, donation model, and for countries to agree to participate in this. What in fact happened, however, what we saw, of course, was the exact opposite of the philanthropic approach. We saw vaccine nationalism, countries rushing to the front of the line to procure doses from numerous companies for not just enough doses for their own populations, but in many cases, rich countries hoarding doses to inoculate their populations many times over. And so the COVAX throughout 2021 struggled to obtain the funding that it needed, struggled to obtain donated doses, and again, every single time just kept falling behind in terms of acquiring doses. And so this reliance on leaving low and middle income countries to depend on this philanthropic donation model, what was the alternative to that was something that we saw emerge, and this is the third prong in terms of ultimately, unfortunately, a failure, but we saw an effort from October 2020 at the World Trade Organization there was an effort particularly led by South Africa and India to issue a waiver at the WTO of intellectual property rights during the pandemic. The initial waiver proposal by South Africa and India was to focus on all areas of intellectual property, so not just patents, but trade secrets, copyright, and in all kinds of COVID-related diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, so well beyond vaccines. The efforts basically met an impasse, needing full consensus approval in the WTO. Europe and the European Union, Japan, up until May 2021, even the United States had opposed this waiver. There was a dramatic about course in May 2021 when the US put its support behind the waiver, but still with persistent opposition from the European Union. For example, this waiver never did get off the ground. There was ultimately ministerial decision issued this past June, which really by and large just affirms the status quo of exceptions that had largely been seen to be either irrelevant or largely practical failures with respect to really spurring the production of the needed amount of COVID-19 doses in 2021. So really, we just saw affirmation of the status quo ultimately. Now, I just one word on this, right? I would present the waiver as the opposite approach from the COVAX approach. So the COVAX approach kind of would leave IP protections in place, but rely on donations and philanthropy to meet the needs of low and middle income countries, whereas the waiver basically was a more affirmative approach where low and middle income countries and 2/3 of the members of the WTO supported this, but again, without getting the European Union and some other critical actors on board, they weren't able to get this to pass. But here the idea is no, countries should be able to waive these IPs to meet the needs of the emergency health needs of their populations. And that, of course, did not ultimately come to pass. So we talk about two other critical failures that occurred. One was India. All eyes had been on India to actually produce the vaccines that the developing world needed. India has been called the pharmacy to the developing world, and the Serum Institute is one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines. The vaccines and medicines produced by generic manufacturers in India are critical to serving the needs of the African continent and many countries in South America, Latin America, and Asia. And there were contracts that the Serum Institute had entered into to manufacture doses for COVAX in particular. And they had made, at least ideological commitments to serve low-income populations first. But in May 2021, when India itself was hit with another deadly wave of COVID, the Indian government also entered into an official vaccine nationalist position, directing all COVID vaccine doses to the Indian population first. There are a number of reasons why India was just caught absolutely ill-prepared. The leadership didn't plan ahead. I think they were out boasting about how India would save the world rather than actually attending to what needed to be done in terms of the investments and contracts and really helping to scale up domestic manufacture in the way that they should have. But again, we saw the failure of the pharmacy to the developing world fail to deliver. And the final, and all of these are demonstrated by different chapter contributions in the book. But the final one that Peter Yu, I think, powerfully makes is China's role here. So China basically took a middle neutral stance during the WTO waiver negotiations. And so ultimately China too pursued a policy of keeping intellectual property rules in place and really promoting their own domestic innovation via traditional intellectual property incentives and combining that with a donation, a vaccine diplomacy model where they would protect their tech and only share the final products in terms of doses for some kind of presumably political gain through this practice of vaccine diplomacy. So a number of places where we think we could have seen a different model emerge, and we didn't. So even India's approach really was also about protecting IP and IP licensing along with donation vaccine diplomacy approach. The paper, and this is the part where I think we're still waiting for more of our chapters. I'm going to wrap up, but we're still waiting for more of our chapters to come in. But in terms of thinking about some of the cures, I'm going to go to, so some of the cures, I think one, really focusing on enhanced legal requirements for technology transfer. So this was the big failure that we saw, patents, a lot of the debate at the IP waiver WTO in those negotiations was about, even if we're going to have a waiver, keep it limited to patents, keep it limited to vaccines only. And what we saw is that patents were really largely beside the point. Moderna said they weren't even going to enforce their patent here. But what was needed was access to the critical know-how and show-how underlying this mRNA technology, and really feeling that there was not effective mechanisms to force technology transfer of this tacit knowledge. And so we have fantastic contributions from people like Peter Lee at UC Davis School of Law and others, really looking at how we can make within national and international laws the mechanisms to transfer that know-how and show-how more robust. And so we've got some great contributions there. And then also a contribution from Professors Ruth Okadiji and Terry Fisher at Harvard, looking at how to foster local manufacturing capacity. And again, this is moving away from this dependency colonial model, depending where low and middle income countries find themselves depending on philanthropy and donations to meet the critical health needs of their populations, and rather thinking ahead now in terms of what would be needed. Africa, for example, imports 99% of its vaccines. And so there is now being launched an effort to have Africa be, the continent be much more prepared to meet a significant percentage of its vaccine needs by 2040. And so what are the various investments and legal innovations that we need to see emerge to foster local manufacturing capacity? So I think, let me also just say that another area that I think that we need, I'll end on this, like we need further research in, and Professor Funmi Ariwa has an important contribution, is thinking about, again, this kind of decolonizing this model around innovation, intellectual property, and global public health. She's got a chapter on colonial hangovers, basically saying, we need to be attentive to why do we have such poor health systems in low-income African countries and elsewhere. To what extent are they the result of extractive colonial policies? And if that is the case, what kind of reparations may be needed in terms of funding, again, these efforts for local manufacturing capacity, for example, but also thinking about, in the philanthropic model, the absence of African leadership from the corridors of decision-making, and absence from the table there. So where we see, ideas like COVAX are, rules and this brainchild, but really these decisions are being made by others for Africa, and often at Africa's expense. So thinking about these broader structures in terms of global governance and decolonizing these, and also thinking in terms of reparations and justifications for high-income countries contributing to the funding that's necessary to see enhanced local manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries. I'm going to end there and stop sharing. Thank you.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you, Madhavi. I mean, this is a fantastic project, right? And it obviously gets to the core of the distinction between other perspectives of why we have an IP system, right? That, oftentimes one can say that the natural rights perspective is somewhat agnostic towards whether or not the intellectual labor is directed towards benefiting society. The economic perspective sort of implicitly presumes that the end result is going to benefit society, but that's market dependent. And as your first slide demonstrated, right, that as the comment from the IP public service, Goslin, I think was the slide.
Yes.
Right, Austin indicated that, yeah, but an economic-centric model will not support where the end result is only going to impact a small market. So, I mean, your presentation just goes right to the heart of why we need to think about the role of IP in solving these problems differently, right? And that it has to be about encouraging it to the larger, greater good. And a different perspective would not tolerate the type of end results that prevailing rationales tolerated and indeed perhaps even encouraged in this context. So I think we're all going to be very much looking forward to this book coming out. And of course, you've collected, just a universe of like first tier contributions. So I'm clearing a space on my shelf for that. And so with that, let us turn to our next presenter, Dr. Metka Potočnik, who's now going to guide us in the direction of, all right, so now we've seen how things, when we don't use the right perspective, how can we employ the proper perspective in the proper context with the proper tools to move towards a better result? Metka?
Thank you, Lateef, and thank you, Madhavi. It was an excellent talk, I think, especially as a start to the IP Mosaic, and hopefully we'll have some sense of direction at the end of it all. So what is the next step? Today's talk is, I'm not going to pretend to represent the WIPO position in any way, but I did want to share, and we thought it might be helpful for everyone that's familiar with the IP Social Justice Institute to just see a little bit around the international work and really how that works with the role of accredited observers. So WIPO, and if I could just get a nod that the slide did move this time around. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Lateef. So I thought that it might just be helpful to have this brief discussion around WIPO accredited observers and really the role of experts that we deem ourselves to be, and we want to contribute that voice and perhaps a non-market input into the IP system. And once I sort of cover just really briefly around the WIPO accredited observers role, I wanted to flag the WIPO development agenda and again, not to represent everything they're doing, but the Committee on Development and IP that I learned more about by participating in the meetings they've had so far on behalf of the Institute of IP Social Justice. And finally, I'll just point to one or two tools that have just recently been launched by WIPO, and I'm not really sure if everyone knows of them. And they're always pitched as tools that will help inventors and creators in the developing world. And all I'm thinking is that they will be very helpful also for the underrepresented groups in our own countries. So creators and inventors that perhaps are not yet part of the IP system, they don't have access or perhaps power within the system. So if I just sort of start with, so something I've learned, WIPO accredited observers, there's two types actually, you have, or several types, but when it comes to finding the Institute of IP Social Justice, I did a brief Google search and I said, oh, we're not on the list. And of course, I contacted WIPO, they're very helpful, and they told me, well, you're looking at the wrong list. You're looking at international NGOs, and you're listed under national NGOs. So there are different types of accredited observers that WIPO will accept. And you can see that we have 195 organizations listed under international NGOs that are accredited observers. And we have 96 organizations that are national NGOs with WIPO. And of course, this is not, it's a growing list, but I can tell you that it is not without controversy. So when Wikimedia was or was it Wikipedia, when that was discussed in the last General Assembly, it wasn't really supported. So the status of accredited observer was not supported by some member states. So it's not always a given that you'll be granted this status, if you will. So WIPO accredited observers are a way of getting non-state actors and organizations, NGOs, whether international or national, to participate in the WIPO meetings, in the discussions, and perhaps in some of the plannings and agendas. But if you're ever participating in the WIPO process, you will very quickly learn if before it goes without say, if before you're not really keyed into this message, is that WIPO is a UN agency and it is driven by UN member states. So it is the member states that have the mandate. They will shape the agenda, and you cannot really do anything without the member states' support. So keeping that in mind when you are sort of trying to push for change or trying to think how to participate with or get your points across in the discussions, it's important to remember that it is the member states that are driving the sort of the process itself. So access is enabled through the WIPO Accredited Observers scheme, if you will, but that doesn't mean that we have the same power or equity as the member states. There has been recently in the 29th CDIP, so that's the Committee for Development and IP meeting. So that was just trying to say, I think it was last week or the week before, they've discussed the role of experts and how important it is to have conferences, and that's been supported by most member states. But of course, it will be the member states themselves that will be choosing the experts and actually granting the experts access to these discussions. So WIPO observers, how they're seen is, and the general stance is that WIPO welcomes the inclusion of stakeholder organizations and interest groups as observers, right? So, and when you do attend the meetings, if member states, for example, will have, let's say, I don't know, 3 minutes for their general key points, an accredited observer is given a minute for their intervention. And you can imagine how much you can say in a minute, but of course you have the ability to submit a written statement. So, and it's sort of a mixed approach. Some accredited observers do take the floor and say a few things as much as you can in a minute. I'm not entirely sure what the IP Social Justice Institute's position will be on doing those 1 minute interventions, but maybe Lateef will sort of specialize in that, a minute observation or intervention. So you can see that WIPO will involve NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, industry groups, and all other stakeholders as widely as possible in consultation process. And this is really where the Institute can expand its role beyond the domestic focus or intervention, if you will, where most of the activities have been happening so far. So the one area where I thought perhaps we are to investigate the role of the Institute further is the development agenda for WIPO. And, you know, just recently there was a celebration of the few years of the agenda since it's been adopted. And the members who attended the 29th meeting of the Committee of the Development and IP said that WIPO development agenda is very, very what is key about this is that there was a paradigm shift from private rights and market to IP as perhaps a useful tool in development and achieving those development goals. So they don't say social justice as such, but there seems to be a very helpful shift in focus and or a paradigm shift that you see from WIPO, and where it previously was, where the most of the focus was in protecting IP as private rights. Now, of course, nothing is perfect, and where my suggestion is not that everything is already solved and nothing more needs to be done, but this is a fruitful area, I think, for everyone to consider if you are looking at beyond just the borders of a particular country, to look at the work that WIPO is doing under the development agenda. And you can see that there are 445 adopted recommendations that are sort of the boundaries within which WIPO and the Committee for Development and IP is putting forward proposals. And I wanted to share this, and of course this will now, I've tested it before, but let's see. It is without sound, this video, but I found it very helpful before actually giving you some examples of the current projects that member states are working on. I just wanted to give you, it's literally a minute, 22 seconds on how do these projects come together. So if you're thinking about, oh, I have an idea, how, so let's just see if we can now. I'll make it full screen. I'll just check. So Lateef, was that moving when? Yeah, perfect. So I'll just. Okay, so I will now just, okay, there we go. So hopefully that just gives you a very brief idea of how these projects come together. And I mean, just a few weeks ago, they said that, I think it was Tunisia putting forward a proposal of let's look at how IP could be used in reducing occupational health hazards and death that happens at workplace. So there's so many interesting projects coming through this particular pipeline, but you can see here on the, so I've just screenshotted a few of the projects. So with everything's available online. So the work that's undertaken under the development agenda projects, you will have the project title and then you have the related studies, everything listed. So I just did that for the first one. So you see that there is a wealth of information available online. And, you know, then you have these different projects that are sort of tied into this. Things like increasing the role of women in innovation and entrepreneurship, encouraging women in developing countries to use the IP system. And you have then scoping studies, you have examples, and depending on where the project is at. So, you know, the further down the line the project is, the more information available. And it's such a interesting space really to find what people have done or what WIPO in partnership with some of the developing countries has done. And sometimes it will give you an idea of perhaps interventions in your own country, because it just makes sense. So things like the, you know, innovator networking schemes. I've worked with a doctor recently, and she said that there's no way to connect with other women inventors, and we're in the UK. So there's different things to consider. So in this particular space, and because there's room for interventions, the Institute of IP Social Justice can think about, and we are thinking about, really this international area of focus, if you will. And of course, it's very helpful. We have both Lateef and Steve here on the call, so they will be able to correct anything I sort of misrepresent in terms of where the international sort of policy or agenda or plan for the Institute is. But the idea is not to shift the focus entirely. It's just that we want to have the IP social justice theory and interventions. We want to have those exchanges and discussion participation also in this international forum, mainly in international policymakers, WIPO, WTO, not perhaps the comparative approach where we would go to different countries and sort of have those interactions, or at least not yet. Anyway, and I did find it very helpful to see that the Institute has been given this status of accredited observer already in 2011. So last year we had a decade of this status, and it's an ongoing opportunity that we will continue to develop. Of course, with the pandemic opening up the opportunity of hybrid meetings as well, it's probably realistically, that's made the world of difference, that we can now go into these meetings regardless of what our schedules are. So I would be teaching in the morning and in the afternoon jump into Geneva just because I can. Whereas if you had to give up an entire week, let's say whether it's October or July, planning wise, that becomes entirely different, notwithstanding the cost and all of that to be considered as well. So I've been already attending some of the General Assemblies last October and this July, and you see you already have the dates for next July, so you can think about perhaps planning, right? If you did want to go there and perhaps do some of that networking with maybe some of the member states, you could do, because you know that from July 6th to July 14th, next year, you could be in Geneva for this. The accredited observer has to put in the paperwork to say, yes, this person is our representative. So the WIPO will follow up on that, and not everyone can register. With any meeting you will attend, you then, of course, also get access to the meeting documents, and you can see everything. And you can see the process, what the Secretariat has put forward, and then interventions from the member states. So by attending these meetings, you get a better appreciation of how the organization itself makes these decisions. So it's not just about access, it's also about understanding who has decision-making power. And with the, so this meeting, so it was tempted to say last week, although I'm not really counting weeks anymore properly because it's October and it's a bit busy. So we had the Committee on Development and Intellectual Property, where, again, it was hybrid. And this was really where we seen the discussions around many of the projects I've mentioned previously. So as a conclusion of this talk, I wanted to just share two tools that, so one of the things is not only that we learn by accredited observers, not only do we learn what the organization itself does, but also perhaps we might find useful examples of tools that are made available in other countries that perhaps we might use or want to use also in our own work when we're thinking about access for underrepresented groups to IP systems, or perhaps even better equity and power of the system. So one is, and I don't know whether it exists comparatively in the US, whether it exists in some of the other countries as well. I know the UK Intellectual Property Office had something of a similar nature. So what was it called? I think it was called the Health IP Check or something like that, that businesses could do very easily online to see if they're thinking about all the IP rights they should have. So the WIPO IP diagnostics tool that was just launched very recently, it's a very useful system because you sort of check through, a business will check everything that they need to be, that they are doing. So whether they're selling goods, whether they're designing packages and things like that. And then it will give them a written report, a PDF of whether they should be thinking about patents and what that might involve, whether they should be thinking about trademarks and the cost that would involve, or considerations, what is a good trademark, what is a bad trademark. So in a way, even though it's not targeting developed markets, you can imagine that if you're working with creatives or innovators, this is a link you can send them to, and it costs nothing. It's something that can be accessed for free. And for you, it also takes away the burden of writing up that general information every time somebody might ask you. So it's perhaps a helpful tool. And I'll just end with the WIPO Match video, if you will. So WIPO Match is something that was, again, mentioned or introduced. I know it's been launched a few months back, but it's been introduced again with the last week's meeting, a CDIP meeting, and WIPO Match is matching different organizations. So organizations that might have an interest in developing IP, and then perhaps in organizations that can offer that specialized support, if you will. So let's just see if this will work. Okay, there we go. Here. Okay, so I'll just check. Did you hear this sound?
WIPO Match is a free online platform that serves innovators around the world. It's a growing community working together to drive innovation and creativity in developing countries and countries in transition. The WIPO Match platform connects innovators who need technical assistance in intellectual property with providers and supporters offering tailored resources. This enables connections and fosters strategic partnerships, which translate into new opportunities. WIPO Match connections are valuable in leveraging IP skills, services, and infrastructure from resource providers to accelerate development, contribute towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and improve lives everywhere. Join us. Together, we make IP work for everyone.
Right. So with that, I thought I would end with that sort of, I guess, final demonstration of the, I think, paradigm shift at WIPO, and you know, everything we have been talking about really around making IP work for more than just the economic interest or in the interest of the market space. But I'll leave it there, and hopefully there's some time for a Q&A as well.